Good morning, everyone. We're going to just give it about 30 more seconds, see if anybody else pops in, and then we'll get started. It's good to see all of you. Good morning, Brandy. Glad you're here.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to go ahead and get started this morning. Happy Friday to everybody. We're glad that you could join us here. We are going to be talking about organizing and analyzing diverse learners' data today. So if you are new to us, we are the Diverse Learners Cooperative. We are a nonprofit that strives to connect teachers and leaders to the professional learning, resources, and networks that they need to improve outcomes for their diverse learners and help them feel more empowered and effective within their own classrooms. My name is Mary, and I will be guiding you through our topic today. We are going to start by reviewing some methods that you can use for gathering and organizing student data. There's always a lot of different data types to collect, and so we'll talk about just a couple of ways that you can get started there. And then we'll go through a process that we use to analyze students' progress so that we can determine the next steps that we should take in our instruction to help improve their outcomes. So we'll go over some important data points, the process that we have, and then some next steps for planning. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to throw them in the chat. We'll also open it up at the end for a discussion with some questions. My colleague Josh is here to answer anything in the chat as you go along, so feel free to throw in anything there as well. So as we all know, this year has been unlike any other, and collecting data and monitoring student progress has been severely impacted by our transitions between virtual and in-person learning. If we have been mostly in virtual learning this year, or if you've been doing some sort of hybrid method, we know that overall we've had limited, if any, face-to-face contact with students. And this has made it really challenging to not only see them and build relationships, but also collect data and analyze the progress that they're making. There were also a lot fewer resources available virtually. A lot of platforms have since caught up and provided some different tools that can be used. But in the beginning, last spring, when this all first started, we really didn't have a lot of options to be able to determine how students were doing. And especially this was the case for non-academic checks on student progress, right? Whether those were social or emotional checks, whether you were trying to measure students' language development or their communication skills, or even their pre-vocational or executive functioning skills that they might need. And having a variety of IEP or even ILP language goals as well requires multiple types of assessment per student. So it can be hard to keep all of this together and organized. Measuring outcomes of instructional plans for all types of skills often places the burden of identification of a data collection approach directly on the special educator. This applies to our multilingual educators too, right? Our teachers working with our EL students. They are usually responsible for figuring out which pieces of the puzzle to not only pick out, but then also connect. And so it's really important that we do take time to hone our skills in this area, because we do need that broad array of data collection and analysis skills to not only monitor student progress, but make really critical data-based informed decisions that are going to help students move forward. So what types of data can we collect? If you want to take a second and throw in the chat, what's one example of a data source that you use to measure student progress? Feel free to just type it in the chat box. AimsWeb, yep, that can be a great platform to use to collect all different types of academic data. FastBridge is another one. Exit tickets, yes, that's a great one for measuring students' progress in the gen ed classroom. Freckle, oh, I haven't heard of that, Mary Cruz. I'll have to hear more about that. Easy CBM, yes, these are all great. So when we think about our sources of data, we think first usually about all these different platforms, right? But we can also take a step back further and think about the different quantitative versus qualitative data sources that we have available to us. So when we think about quantitative, that's where we usually name these platforms first, right? We think of those academic probes or those universal screeners that are going to give us really specific information about students' academic skills. Quantitative data can also be behavioral data, the number of prompts a student needs or how frequently they engage in a certain behavior. It could also be prompting procedures as well. When we think about qualitative, this is just as valuable of a data source as too. It really tells the story about what a student is learning and doing, right? We can look at pre-vocational checklists, even anecdotal notes, things that we observe about the students in the classroom. We can also leverage parent or teacher interviews as a source of data here. We know that our parents are experts on their children, and so they can provide some valuable insights, especially during virtual learning, that we might not otherwise not have been aware of. And then finally, even asking about students about their interests and motivations can be a great way to find out information that will help us increase their engagement in our classroom. So when we think about all those different pieces and all those different sources, it can be a lot to figure out how to gather and organize it. So ultimately, you want to find a system that works for you, because the easier and the more flexible it is for you, the more efficient that you will be in collecting that data. So whether this is in person or virtually, handwritten or using tech, some people still prefer to use the paper hard copies, and that is a-okay. Some students prefer it too. You can also decide if you're going to collect it daily or weekly. Some teachers like to do one student a day and it becomes just a normal part of their daily routine. Others would rather batch it as a whole group, maybe on a Wednesday or a Friday, and do it all at once. You can also decide if you are going to be the one to administer it, or if you're going to collect data through student-produced products. This can be really helpful if you do have a large group of students on your caseload, especially if you're serving multiple grade levels or multiple classes. That might be an easier way to collect and analyze data. When we think about organizing it, again, we want to think about the method and the type. It's likely that you'll combine multiple methods here. So that's why the organization is key, right? You're going to have some paper products, especially some, maybe those exit tickets or those different instructional materials. You might also have some tech. So using calendar reminders or phone alarms are my favorite. They're the ones that remind me to do everything. Ultimately, regardless of what system you use, you want to make sure that you teach the procedure to your students as well, so that you can move really efficiently whenever it is that you do collect those data sources. When we think about organizing data, we can also determine the method. So not only can we go from paper and tech, but we can also figure out, how am I going to organize the data to show me a picture or tell me a story about the student? You might decide to organize it by student, right? And so that could look like individual data sheets, Google Forms, task boxes. These slides will be sent out to you. And so I would encourage you to click on this sample form here with sections. It's a forced copy, so you'll have the copy on your own to edit, but this is great for measuring individualized IEP or ILP goals, and it's even split up into sections, so that if you're measuring across multiple content areas, you only have to do one section at a time and not scroll through the whole form. You might also do it by skill. So you might have a picture like the one here on the left that's just an overall dashboard where all of your information is organized or color coded, and it gives you a quick glimpse or a snapshot of where students are on that particular skill. You can also decide to do it by small group. You might have a small group reading class, or you might do a small group of math intervention, and you might take all of the reports for those students just in that group and analyze them all at one time. So again, the key here is to think about what is going to be most efficient and effective for me, because then that will be easier for me to analyze later on. One last thing that you can do is you can use a matrix. This is a topic we talked about in a couple coffee chats ago, but this is a way to just organize the way in which, or the timeline for which, you're going to collect your data. So this matrix that's shown here is on a bi-weekly schedule of all the different classes and the different students that are being served, and the types of data that will be collected per student per class. So this is nice. If you even print this out or you have it on your computer, you could cross it off each week as you do it to make sure you're keeping up with your data collection system and that you're integrating all the different systems that you do have going on. It's also helpful to increase our awareness of which data we are collecting and what the results actually show. And this will help us shorten the cycle so that we can analyze and respond to that data even faster in our instruction with students. So now that we've talked about all the different ways to organize it, let's go through the process of actually analyzing it. So once you've gathered it, you might sound like this teacher in green who came to us and said, my students' progress monitoring data is just all over the chart and I cannot figure out what's happening. This was something that I always had to tackle as a teacher, and I definitely felt this way before too, right? Just not knowing what to do next. So students that are receiving any type of intervention, but especially evidence-based interventions, can still demonstrate difficulty with consistently making progress towards a skill or an IEP goal. And so the analysis is going to be really helpful to determine where that breakdown is happening, what's not working, right? We can identify either specific skill gaps or the deficit areas that need to be targeted, and then plan for changes that we can make to the instruction so that we can improve diverse learners' outcomes. So the approach that we're going to go through is called an error analysis, and it constitutes a deep dive into what is actually going on with a student. So when we think about this data, this is going to be most useful with those typical probes or that type of data that you are collecting from week to week. This could also be used with a student permanent product as long as you have a criterion that you're measuring against so you know what the goal is. Ultimately, what we're going to do is collect this data for at least 4 to 6 weeks and then analyze it. And what that means is that we're going to look at whether or not that criterion was met during each of those samples of data. So again, if you're using an academic probe, you'll likely see graphs like the ones pictured here. But if you're using a student permanent product, such as from a general education class or a language lesson, you might have to set a different criterion and then grade students accordingly so that you can analyze it more effectively. Ultimately, this analysis is going to use what we call the 4-point method. So we're going to take the 4 most recent data points of those 4 to 6 that you collected and see if they're above or below the goal line. And if they're below, we're going to proceed with what we call the error analysis. If they're above, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing great. So when we think about the error analysis, we might see a data pattern that looks like this one here on the right, where the student is above the baseline goal, right? They're making some progress, but it's really steady and almost seems to be flatlining, right? They're not making nearly as much progress as the goal line suggests they should be. So we want to take a look at the environment in this case. We want to ask ourselves, was the intervention implemented with fidelity, or are there extenuating circumstances that are impacting the student's performance when I'm giving this assessment? This could be absences during instruction, so maybe the student is absent multiple days a week or missing your online class. It could be lack of sleep or hunger, some things that are affecting the student physically that are hindering their academic performance. It could even be a home disruption. If our students are remaining virtual, we know that the home environment does not necessarily look like the school environment. And so there might be some distractions or some tech issues that come into play. If our students' data pattern looks like this next graph, where they're really not far above 0 or that bottom goal line, right? That's when we have to ask ourselves, okay, am I actually measuring the right skill? Is it sensitive enough? Am I giving instruction and the assessment consistency enough? We often see this type of pattern, especially when it comes to students' reading levels, right? And so we might have students on a 4th grade who are in a 4th grade class, but they may be reading on a 1st or 2nd grade level. If I'm monitoring students on that 4th grade level, I'm not going to see a really clear picture of what's happening because it's not at their instructional level. So I need to take a step back and also give a probe or replace that probe with one that's on their instructional level so I can actually see if they're growing in their skills, right? So we want to know that they are still accessing grade level content, but we also want to make sure that our measures are sensitive enough to show progress with whatever intervention we're putting into place. And so these graphs here, regardless of what's happening in the environment, ultimately show us that the intervention might not be effective for the student. So we will have to make some changes. The other type of graph you might see is this one. This is the one that I saw most often while teaching, where the student was just up and down from week to week, and I could not get a consistent trend. This is where I had to ask myself, what is happening with the student's skills? First of all, are they engaged or motivated when I'm giving this? Are they doing it during instruction, during the assessment? What do I notice about their behavior or their affect while they're participating in completing this assessment? I also want to think about the skill gaps that could be showing up that the student is struggling with that are making this assessment more difficult. And this can go beyond academics. So not only am I thinking about what skill gaps or deficit areas do they currently have that I'm working on closing, but also what are some of those social or behavioral or self-management skills that they need, whether it's not completing work or attending class. Self-regulation can be huge when it comes to these probes. A lot of them are only 1 to 3 to 5 minutes long. And so if students are not able to regulate during that amount of time, we're going to see that impacted in their data scores. They also might be missing some prerequisite skills that are being assessed in the probe, or they have limited background knowledge. A lot of the times our students are handed a brand new cold read and might not be able to read as quickly or show what they know as well because of that limited background knowledge about what the reading is actually covering. We might also just need extended time or shorter work chunks as well to actually really understand what students know. Sometimes our assessments are just too long and students' motivation peters out by the end, and it's hard to see what they actually do know. So here's an example of an analysis that you might see, right? Here's an example of a running record that a teacher did where they gave the student the passage for 1 minute, and this is how far the student got in the passage. I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to just take a look at some of the errors, and the student's graph is on the right. Think about what you notice in terms of the types of errors that are being made. Feel free to throw in the chat box, what are some reasons that you think this student might not be making progress? If we look at their graph, we notice that the most recent 4 points are below the goal line, but that overall the student has typically been trending upward. So some progress is being made. What skills do you think the student is still struggling with that are impacting their progress here based on the errors that you see? Feel free to throw it in the chat. Yeah, some examples are they are starting with the first letter of the word. Yep, they're starting with that initial sound and guessing the rest of the word. They might not be decoding the words. They might just be guessing based on that first sound. So that might tell me that one of the prerequisite skills here is that the student needs more instruction in decoding or really tackling the middle sounds here in the word and making sure that we are not just guessing. So yes, that's a great example. I see some agreement here. Thanks so much. So yes, so that would just be one way to start to take that deep dive and figure out, okay, what are just, I notice right off the top that my student may be struggling with that I can improve my instruction in that area to give them what they need to be successful with this assessment. When we think about our multilingual learners specifically, a lot of people will ask us, well, I don't necessarily have a specific probe for them, or, I only have them during my inclusion time, so it's hard for me to get that kind of data. The thing that we know about our multilingual learners is that we can assess a lot of their language skills through the content that we're already working with. So we don't necessarily need an additional specific assessment. We can take that deep dive into the assessments that we already have from the classroom and from the content and look at what kind of language assistance they might need, right? So we can start with their access scores and look at their year-end goals that we have decided upon, match these with what the performance definitions say, and then use those definitions to measurably determine whether or not students are making progress in their language goals. So when we have those really specific definitions, it gives us those clear look-fors into what students should be able to do. And so then when we compare those together, we don't need a separate assessment to do that, right? We can take their writing samples, we can take their work from the classroom, and we can see, okay, how is this matching up or how is this not matching up? And then once we're doing that regularly enough, we'll start to see patterns, and that will really help us to identify the areas or the gaps that we can close with our instruction. So once you've taken the time to analyze the data, now what? We want to plan a strategy, right? Oftentimes, if you are working with students in a small group intervention, one of the things that you'll do is you'll do a diagnostic assessment. So you might notice that multiple students within your class are doing just fine, they're making enough progress, but one student is not. Take a deep dive with that student and do a specific diagnostic assessment in the deficit area, right? So for example, within reading, for that student that we saw in the example, you might need to do a phonics inventory or even a syllable assessment to figure out what they are struggling to learn, right? From there, we want to make sure that we're then conducting our intervention with fidelity. A lot of times teachers will have all the tools that they need, but because of schedules and testing and all these types of changes, we're not actually providing instruction in a way that's consistently effective, right? So making sure that we are implementing our instruction with fidelity. We could consider making changes to group size, how long our intervention is, how frequently it is, right? Sometimes shorter, quicker sessions are better if they're happening more frequently, or depending on your schedule, you might need longer sessions, but less frequently. And then once a change is made, progress monitor for those additional 4 points and then repeat the process. If the student improves, continue with what you've done, right? Continue with those changes and keep going so that they continue to make progress. If not, return to that error analysis and see if there was something that you missed, right? Is something else popping up that is hindering the student's success? And what can I do to find out more? Ultimately, we want to reflect and adjust. So take the time that you are using to take and collect this data and students' work samples, and then just ask yourself a couple of questions. Where was the student successful? What strengths can I build upon in order to then target those other skills? Where do they need to continue to grow? Was this assessment actually effective? Did it actually tell me anything, or do I need a more sensitive measurement? What's going well? What can be better? And what is my next best step? From there, you can align your instruction. So you can use the data to improve your future instruction by making quantitative changes to the amount of instruction or the type of instruction you're providing, or qualitative changes, the method by which you are delivering that instruction. For example, you might pair some specific self-monitoring strategies with your content instruction so that students are better able to regulate during class and they're better able to stay focused on their assignment. Ultimately, what we want to remember is that we don't just want to put a strategy into place without checking that's actually going to be one that breaks down the barrier that we're seeing. We want to make sure that those are aligned so it actually has an impact. Here are some further learning resources that you can use. On the left is an intervention intensification checklist. So if you do notice that your intervention is not quite meeting students' needs, this gives a great list of suggestions to go through and try some of these. Again, align those with the barrier that you currently have. On the right, if you want further learning, here is a mini course about data-based individualization that you can use in order to take that 1 or 2 students' data and figure out how to change your instruction. So we are going to wrap up here with just one discussion question in a minute, but we would love to see you after spring break to talk about strategies for building reading comprehension for our diverse learners. So now feel free to unmute. We're going to just share what's one takeaway that you've had for organizing and analyzing your learners' data.